The crimson sun bled across the Montana sky as Katherine Porter stood on the porch of her small homestead, staring at the empty trail that wound through the valley like a dusty serpent. 3 months had passed since her husband's letter promised his imminent return from the gold fields of California. 3 months of waiting, of hoping, of praying, all met with silence as cruel as the coming winter. The year was 1876, and the promise of fortune had lured many men west, including her beloved Thomas. What was supposed to be a 6-month venture had stretched into 18, with only sporadic letters carrying promises and dreams. The last letter, dog-eared and worn from countless readings, had simply stated, "I've struck it rich, my darling. I'm coming home to you." Katherine pulled her woolen shawl tighter around her shoulders as the autumn wind picked up, rustling the dying leaves of the cottonwood tree. At 24, the weight of maintaining the homestead alone had carved premature lines around her eyes, though they remained as fiercely blue as the day Thomas had fallen in love with them. "Mrs. Porter?" A deep voice startled her from her reverie. Katherine turned to find a tall figure silhouetted against the setting sun. As he stepped forward, she recognized the rugged features of Flynn Donovan, a cowboy who occasionally helped at the McDermott Ranch a few miles down the valley. His hat was respectfully clutched in his hands, revealing dark hair that curled slightly at the ends. "Mr. Donovan," she acknowledged with a nod. "What brings you this way?" Flynn shifted uncomfortably. "I was passing through town when I overheard some talk at the general store. Sheriff Mason received a telegram from California yesterday." He paused, his green eyes filled with a gentleness that made Katherine's heart tighten with dread. "There was a mining accident in the Sierra Nevada. Several men were lost." Katherine's hand flew to her throat. "Thomas?" "They found his claim, madam. It was abandoned. No one's seen him for months, but—" Flynn's words hung in the air, unfinished, yet devastating in their implication. "He never came home," Katherine whispered, her voice breaking as she stared past Flynn toward the horizon where the sun was now half swallowed by the mountains. The cowboy's jaw set with determination as he stepped closer. "Then I'll bring you there myself, Mrs. Porter. If your husband is out there, we'll find him. And if not—" He didn't complete the thought, but the offer hung between them like a lifeline. Katherine studied the man before her, a stranger, really, though she'd seen him in town, and exchanged pleasantries on occasion. He stood just over 6 feet tall, broad-shouldered and lean, his face weathered by sun and wind. He couldn't have been more than 30, but his eyes carried the wisdom of someone who had seen much in his years. "Why would you do this for me?" she asked, suspicious yet desperate. "Because no one should be left wondering," Flynn answered simply. "I lost my sister 5 years back. Fever took her, but for days before we knew for certain, the not knowing was worse than the grief itself." Katherine considered his words, considered the homestead that felt more like a prison with each passing day, considered the meager savings that wouldn't last another winter. "When would we leave?" "First light tomorrow, if you're willing." "It's a long journey to California, Mrs. Porter. Not one for the faint of heart. I've been managing this homestead alone for 18 months, Mr. Donovan. I'm anything but faint of heart." There was steel beneath her words, a determination that matched his own. Flynn nodded, a hint of respect flickering in his eyes. "Pack light. We'll take the train as far as we can, then horses the rest of the way. I've got some savings set aside." "I can pay my own way," Katherine said firmly. "Of course, madam." Flynn replaced his hat. "I'll return at dawn." As the cowboy walked away, Katherine remained on the porch, watching until his form disappeared into the gathering darkness. Only then did she allow herself a moment of weakness, a single tear tracking down her cheek as she whispered to the night, "Hold on, Thomas. I'm coming to find you." The dawn brought a chill that penetrated Katherine's wool coat as she stood beside the small trunk containing the few belongings she deemed necessary for the journey. She had spent the night sorting through practical items, sturdy clothes, a hunting knife that had belonged to her father, the pistol Thomas had taught her to shoot before he left, and all the money she had managed to save. The sound of hoofbeats pulled her attention to the trail, where Flynn Donovan appeared, leading not only his own chestnut gelding but a sturdy Palomino mare as well. He dismounted in a fluid motion that spoke of years in the saddle. "The mare's name is Penny," Flynn said by way of greeting. "She's gentle but sure-footed. Should serve you well on the journey." Katherine approached the horse cautiously, extending her hand to let the animal catch her scent. "She's beautiful," she murmured as the mare nudged her palm. "You ride?" Flynn asked, eyeing her skeptically. "Since I was a girl," Katherine replied, raising her chin slightly. "My father believed women should know how to ride as well as any man." "Your father was a wise man." Flynn moved to secure her trunk behind his saddle. "We should reach Great Falls by nightfall. From there, we'll catch the train west." Katherine nodded, taking a final look at the homestead. She had left everything in order, asked her nearest neighbor, old Mrs. Abernathy, to check on the place occasionally. Still, a pang of uncertainty gripped her as she contemplated leaving behind the only home she had known since her marriage. "We'll find answers, Mrs. Porter," Flynn said quietly, as if reading her thoughts. "Katherine," she corrected him, "if we're to travel together for weeks, perhaps formalities can be set aside." Flynn nodded. "Flynn, then." The first day's ride was mostly silent, each lost in their own thoughts as they made their way northwest toward Great Falls. Katherine found herself studying her companion when he wasn't looking. Flynn Donovan sat tall in the saddle, his movements economical yet graceful. There was an alertness to him, a constant awareness of their surroundings that made her feel oddly safe despite the uncertainty of their mission. "How did you come to Montana?" she asked as they stopped to rest the horses near a small creek. Flynn unscrewed his canteen, taking a long drink before answering. "Originally from Missouri. My pa died in the war when I was 12. Ma remarried a man who wanted to start fresh out west. Been here since '65. And your people now?" "Gone," he said simply. "Ma passed 3 years ago. My stepfather headed back east afterward. Couldn't stomach the winters anymore," he said. Katherine nodded, understanding the unspoken reality of loss that seemed to shadow everyone in these territories. "And you became a cowhand." "It's honest work," Flynn replied with a shrug. "I'm good with horses, better with a gun. Not much else to recommend me." There was something in his self-deprecation that made Katherine want to probe deeper, but the wall around him was palpable. Instead, she asked about their route, listening intently as he laid out the journey ahead: train to Salt Lake City, then horses through Nevada and into California. "The Sierra Nevada can be treacherous this time of year," Flynn warned. "If snow comes early, we might have to hole up somewhere until spring." "I understand the risks," Katherine said firmly, "but I need to know what happened to Thomas, one way or another." Flynn studied her face for a moment, then nodded. "We'll find her answers, Katherine. I promise you that." They reached Great Falls as dusk painted the buildings in amber light. The town was a bustling center of commerce compared to the small settlement near Katherine's homestead, with streets lined with establishments catering to travelers and locals alike. Flynn secured them 2 rooms at a modest hotel near the train station, insisting that Katherine take the slightly larger one. "Rest well," he advised as they parted in the hallway. "Train leaves at noon tomorrow. It'll be a long ride to Salt Lake City." Alone in her room, Katherine finally allowed exhaustion to claim her. As she lay on the unfamiliar bed, staring at the ceiling, she wondered what Thomas would think of her impulsive journey. Her practical, cautious husband, who planned everything meticulously, would likely be shocked by her decision to travel across the country with a man she barely knew. "I'm coming to find you," she whispered into the darkness, just as she had the night before. But this time, a small voice inside her wondered if she was truly seeking Thomas or answers she might not be prepared to hear. Morning brought a flurry of activity as they purchased train tickets and supplies for the journey ahead. Katherine noticed how Flynn's demeanor shifted in town, more alert, his hand never far from the Colt revolver holstered at his hip. When she questioned him about it, he merely shrugged. "Habit," he said, but his eyes continued to scan the crowds as they waited for the train. The locomotive arrived in a cloud of steam and coal smoke, its whistle piercing the air as it pulled into the station. Katherine had only traveled by train once before, when she and Thomas had journeyed to Montana from Missouri after their wedding. The memory of his excitement, his promises of the life they would build together, struck her with fresh pain. Flynn must have noticed her distress, for he placed a gentle hand on her elbow. "One step at a time," he said quietly. "That's all we can do." The train journey to Salt Lake City took 3 days, during which Katherine found herself gradually warming to Flynn's company. He was not a man of many words, but when he did speak, his observations were thoughtful and occasionally laced with a dry humor that surprised her. He shared stories of his time working cattle drives, of the characters he'd encountered along the way, and of the vast, wild beauty of the territories he'd traversed. "Have you ever thought of settling down?" she asked on the second evening, as they sat in the dining car watching the landscape roll by. Flynn's expression grew distant. "Once," he admitted. "There was a woman in Cheyenne, daughter of a rancher I worked for. Rebecca." He spoke the name softly, like a prayer. "We were to be married in the spring of '73. "What happened?" Katherine asked, sensing the story didn't have a happy ending. "Cholera outbreak that winter. Took half the town, including her and her family." Flynn's hand tightened around his coffee cup. "I haven't stayed in one place too long since." "I'm sorry," Katherine said, reaching across the table to briefly touch his hand. The simple gesture of comfort felt bold, almost inappropriate, but Flynn didn't pull away. "Life out here is harsh," he said finally. "Makes the good moments all the more precious, I suppose." They lapsed into silence, the rhythmic clacking of the train wheels providing a backdrop to their thoughts. Katherine found herself studying Flynn's profile against the window, the strong line of his jaw, the slight furrow between his brows that never quite disappeared, the way his eyes reflected the dying light of the day. She looked away quickly when he turned toward her, afraid he might read something in her expression that she wasn't ready to acknowledge, even to herself. Salt Lake City greeted them with unexpected warmth for late October. The city stood as a testament to human determination, carved from the wilderness by Mormon settlers who had transformed the desert into a thriving community. They spent 2 days there, securing horses and supplies for the next leg of their journey. Flynn was methodical in his preparations, insisting on the best quality gear they could afford. "The mountains won't forgive poor planning," he explained as he examined a heavy blanket. "Better to spend the money now than freeze later." Katherine found herself deferring to his experience, though she insisted on contributing her fair share to their expenses. The money she had saved during Thomas's absence was dwindling faster than she had anticipated, but she pushed aside her concerns. Finding Thomas, or at least discovering what had happened to him, was worth any cost. They departed Salt Lake City on a clear morning, heading west toward the Nevada border. The terrain grew increasingly rugged as they traveled, the gentle plains giving way to rocky foothills. Flynn set a steady pace, mindful of conserving their horses' strength for the mountains ahead. At night, they made camp in sheltered areas, taking turns keeping watch. Flynn taught Katherine to build a proper fire that would provide warmth without sending a beacon to potential trouble. Despite her earlier assertions about her capabilities, she found herself grateful for his knowledge and patience. "My father taught me to shoot and ride," she admitted one evening as they sat beside the fire, "but I've never traveled like this before. Thomas and I came to Montana by train and wagon." "You're doing fine," Flynn assured her. "Better than most men I've ridden with, truth be told." The compliment warmed her more than it should have. 5 days into their journey across Nevada, the weather turned. Dark clouds gathered on the horizon, and Flynn's expression grew concerned as he studied the sky. "We need to find better shelter," he announced, scanning the barren landscape. "That's not a storm we want to get caught in." They pushed the horses harder than usual, heading for a line of cliffs Flynn had spotted in the distance. The wind picked up, carrying a bitter cold that cut through Catherine's layers of clothing. By the time they reached the cliffs, snow had begun to fall light at first, then heavier as the wind drove it sideways. "There!" Flynn pointed to a dark opening in the rock face, a shallow cave that offered protection from the worsening storm. They hurried to unload the horses and get them settled at the back of the cave. Flynn worked quickly to start a fire, while Katherine laid out their bedrolls as far from the entrance as possible. Outside, the storm raged, the wind howling like a wounded animal. "Will it last long?" Katherine asked, huddled close to the small fire. Flynn shook his head. "Hard to say. Could be hours, could be days. Early season storms like this are unpredictable." Katherine nodded, trying to hide her concern. Every delay meant another day without answers, another day that Thomas, if he was still alive, might be slipping further away. "We'll find him, Katherine," Flynn said softly, reading her thoughts once again. "How can you be so sure?" she asked, her voice barely audible over the storm. Flynn was silent for a long moment. "I can't be," he finally admitted. "But I promise to help you find answers, and I don't make promises I don't intend to keep." The storm raged through the night and into the next day. Confined to the cave, they took turns tending the fire and checking on the horses. Conversation flowed more freely in their isolation, moving beyond the practical details of their journey to more personal revelations. Katherine spoke of her childhood in Missouri, of her parents who had died within a year of each other when she was 19, of meeting Thomas at a church social and being charmed by his dreams and ambitions. "He promised me adventure," she said with a sad smile. "A life beyond the small town where I'd spent my entire existence. When he proposed heading west to stake a claim in Montana territory, it seemed like the answer to prayers I hadn't even known I was making." "Was it?" Flynn asked. "The answer to your prayers?" Katherine considered the question carefully. "For a time," she admitted. "The first year was difficult but rewarding. We built something together from nothing. Then the rumors of gold started, and Thomas became restless." "Men get gold fever," Flynn observed. "Makes them blind to what they already have." "Did you ever have it? Gold fever?" Flynn chuckled, a low, warm sound that seemed to fill the cave.
"No, madam.
"I've seen what it does to men. Turns brothers against each other, husbands away from wives. I prefer simpler dreams." "Like what?" Katherine found herself genuinely curious about what drove this complex man. "Land of my own someday.
Cattle.
Maybe horses." He stared into the fire. "A place where a man could put down roots, if he were so inclined." "Sounds like you're more inclined than you let on," Katherine observed gently. Flynn's eyes met hers across the flames. "Maybe I am," he conceded. "At the right time. With the right reasons." Something in his gaze made Katherine's heart quicken, and she looked away, suddenly aware of their isolation and proximity. The storm had created an intimate bubble around them, separate from the world and its expectations. It was both comforting and disconcerting. The storm broke on the third day, leaving behind a landscape transformed by snow. Flynn emerged from the cave first, surveying their surroundings with a critical eye. "It'll slow us down," he announced, "but we can still travel. Snow's not too deep yet." They set out cautiously, the horses picking their way through the freshly fallen snow. The air was crisp and clean, the sky a brilliant blue that seemed to stretch forever. Despite the challenging conditions, Katherine found herself appreciating the stark beauty of the snow-covered desert. "It's breathtaking," she said as they crested a small rise, revealing a vast expanse of white plains stretching toward distant mountains. Flynn nodded in agreement. Nature has a way of making a man feel properly small, he observed. Reminds us we're just passing through. All of us. The philosophical turn surprised Katherine, revealing yet another layer to the man she was coming to respect more each day. Flynn Donovan was not the simple cowboy he pretended to be. There was depth to him, a quiet intelligence that manifested in unexpected moments. They made slower progress through the snow-covered terrain, but Flynn's knowledge of the land proved invaluable. He found sheltered camping spots each night and game to supplement their dwindling supplies. Katherine found herself watching him as he moved through the wilderness with confident ease, impressed by his competence and increasing comfort in his presence. 10 days after leaving Salt Lake City, they reached the California border and began the ascent into the Sierra Nevada. The mountains loomed before them, imposing and majestic, their peaks disappearing into clouds. The pass might be challenging, Flynn warned as they made camp at the foothills. If it's too dangerous, we'll need to find another route. How much longer until we reach the mining camp? Katherine asked, trying to keep the impatience from her voice. 3 days if the weather holds and the pass is clear. Could be a week or more if we have to go around. Flynn studied her face in the firelight. You've been patient, Katherine. A little longer won't matter in the grand scheme. But it mattered to her. Every day increased the gnawing fear that their journey might end in heartbreak rather than reunion. The uncertainty was wearing on her, despite Flynn's steady presence. That night, she dreamed of Thomas not as he had been when he left, full of excitement and ambition, but pale and lost, calling her name from some distant, unreachable place. She woke with tears on her cheeks and a heaviness in her chest. Flynn noticed her subdued mood as they broke camp the next morning, but didn't press for explanations. Instead, he pointed out landmarks as they rode, sharing stories he'd heard from other travelers about the early days of the gold rush. Men went mad with the possibility of fortune, he told her. Left everything behind: homes, families, even their own names sometimes. Created new identities for themselves out here. Do you think that's what happened to Thomas? Katherine asked quietly. That he changed? Became someone else? Flynn considered her question carefully. I don't know your husband, Katherine, but men do strange things when gold is involved. It changes them. Thomas wasn't like that, she insisted, though a small voice of doubt had begun to whisper in the back of her mind. After all, the man who had promised to return within 6 months had been gone for 18, with increasingly infrequent letters. Flynn didn't contradict her, but his silence spoke volumes. The ascent into the mountains grew steeper and more challenging with each passing day. The trail narrowed, sometimes disappearing altogether, forcing them to pick their way carefully along treacherous slopes. Flynn led with confidence, though Katherine noticed his increased vigilance, the way he constantly assessed their surroundings for dangers. On the second day in the mountains, they encountered their first real obstacle, a section of trail that had collapsed, leaving a gap too wide for the horses to jump. We'll need to backtrack, Flynn decided after examining the terrain. Find another way up. The detour cost them a full day, winding through a dense forest before reconnecting with the main trail higher up the mountain. Katherine tried not to show her frustration, but Flynn seemed to sense it nonetheless. I know you're anxious to reach the mining camp, he said as they made camp that night. But rushing in these mountains is a good way to get killed. The answers you're seeking will still be there tomorrow. What if they're not? Katherine blurted out the fear that had been growing since they left Montana. What if we get there and no one knows anything about Thomas? What if this entire journey has been for nothing? Flynn moved to sit beside her, close enough that his shoulder brushed hers. Then at least you'll know you tried everything possible.
There's honor in that, Katherine.
More than most people ever do for those they love. His words, meant to comfort, struck a chord of guilt within her. For hadn't she already begun to question her feelings for Thomas? Hadn't she caught herself looking at Flynn with thoughts that no faithful wife should entertain? I don't know what I'd do, she admitted softly. If we find nothing. If there are no answers. The homestead feels empty now. I'm not sure I could return to that solitude. You're stronger than you realize, Flynn said, his voice gentle. Whatever we find, you'll survive it. And you won't be alone. The implication of his words hung between them, neither willing to acknowledge it directly. Instead, Katherine murmured her thanks and retreated to her bedroll, though sleep proved elusive as she pondered the complications of her heart. The next morning brought clear skies and renewed determination. They pushed harder, making good time along the mountain trail. By mid-afternoon, Flynn announced they were approaching the mining region where Thomas had staked his claim. We should reach Prosperity by nightfall, he said, referring to the small settlement that had sprung up to serve the miners in the area. Katherine's heart raced at the news. After weeks of travel, they were finally close to answers. She urged Penny to a slightly faster pace, earning a warning glance from Flynn. The trail gets tricky here, he cautioned. Better safe than sorry. She nodded, reluctantly reining in her eagerness. Flynn was right, as he had been throughout their journey. Patience had brought them this far. A few more hours wouldn't matter. Prosperity appeared just as the sun was setting, a collection of rough wooden buildings nestled in a narrow valley between towering peaks. Unlike the booming mining towns of a decade earlier, this settlement had a somewhat desolate air, with fewer lights and less activity than Katherine had anticipated. The easy gold's long gone, Flynn explained as they rode slowly down the main street. Only the stubborn ones or the dreamers stay on now. They stopped at the only establishment showing signs of life, a combination saloon and boarding house with a weather-beaten sign that simply read, Miners' Rest. Flynn dismounted first, then helped Katherine down, though she hardly needed the assistance. Let me do the talking initially, he suggested. Mining camps can be wary of strangers, especially women. The interior of the Miners' Rest was dimly lit and heavy with the smell of tobacco and unwashed bodies. A dozen or so men occupied the tables, their conversations dying as Katherine entered with Flynn close behind her. She felt their eyes assessing her, and she lifted her chin, refusing to be intimidated. Flynn guided her to the bar, where a heavy-set man with an impressive mustache was polishing glasses with a questionably clean rag. Evening, Flynn greeted him. Looking for information about a miner who worked claims around here. Name of Thomas Porter. The barkeeper's expression remained impassive. Lot of men come through here. Can't say the name rings a bell. He would have been here for over a year, Katherine interjected, unable to remain silent. He wrote to me about a successful claim in this area. The mention of success drew the attention of a grizzled miner seated nearby. Porter, you say? Tall fella, sandy hair, talked with a bit of a Missouri drawl. Katherine's heart leaped. Yes, that's him. Do you know where he is? The miner exchanged glances with the barkeeper before answering. Knew him. Had a claim about 5 miles north of here. Struck a decent vein last spring, from what I heard. Last spring? Flynn asked sharply. When did you last see him? The miner scratched his beard thoughtfully. Must have been
July?
August? He came into town, bought rounds for everyone, talking big about heading to San Francisco to arrange for proper equipment. Did he say anything about going home? To Montana. Katherine pressed. Lady, half the men who find gold say they're going home. The barkeeper cut in. Most never do. Thomas isn't like that, Katherine insisted, though doubt gnawed at her. He would have come home if he could. A heavy silence fell over the room. Finally, the miner cleared his throat. There was talk. Just talk, mind you. About trouble at Porter's claim after he struck gold. Some unsavory types moved into the area around that time. Flynn's hand moved subtly toward his gun. What kind of trouble? Claim jumping ain't uncommon, the barkeeper said, his voice deliberately casual. Man finds gold, word gets out. Sometimes he don't live long enough to enjoy it. Katherine felt the blood drain from her face. Are you saying Thomas was killed? Nobody's saying that for certain, the miner clarified quickly. But he ain't been seen since August, and his claim's been taken over by the Blackwell brothers. Mean bunch, those two. Flynn's expression hardened at this information. Where can we find these Blackwell brothers? You'd be wise to leave it be, the barkeeper warned. They don't take kindly to questions. My husband might be dead, Katherine said, her voice breaking despite her efforts to remain composed. I've traveled over 1,000 miles for answers. I'm not leaving without them. The miner nodded, something like respect flickering in his rheumy eyes. Their camp is northeast of town, up Grizzly Creek. But you'd be a fool to go there after dark. Wait till morning. Flynn thanked the man and secured them rooms for the night. Katherine's mind was reeling with the implications of what they'd learned. Thomas had found gold, had planned to expand his operation, not return home, as his letter had promised. And now he was missing, possibly dead, his claim taken by men with a reputation for violence. Once they were alone in the narrow hallway between their rooms, Flynn spoke in a low voice. We'll go to the claim tomorrow, see what we can learn. But Katherine, he placed a gentle hand on her arm. Prepare yourself for the worst. She nodded, unable to trust her voice. Flynn hesitated, then pulled her into a brief, awkward embrace. The gesture was so unexpected, so unlike his usual careful distance, that Katherine found herself clinging to him for a moment, drawing strength from his solid presence. Try to rest, he murmured as he released her. Tomorrow will be challenging enough. Sleep eluded Katherine that night as she lay in the lumpy bed, staring at the stained ceiling. Images of Thomas flashed through her mind, smiling as he promised her a future, determined as he packed for California, ghostly pale as imagined him lying somewhere alone, never to return home. Mixed with these were newer, more troubling thoughts of Flynn, of his quiet strength and unwavering support throughout their journey. Morning arrived with a heavy mist clinging to the mountainsides. Flynn had already secured provisions and information about the trail to Grizzly Creek by the time Katherine came downstairs. His expression was grim as he led her to where their horses waited. The barkeeper says the Blackwells have 4 men with them, he informed her as they mounted up. They're known for being trigger-happy, especially with claim jumpers or anyone asking questions about their operation. What's our plan? Katherine asked, adjusting her hat against the morning chill. Flynn checked his revolver before returning it to his holster. We approach carefully, say we're just passing through, looking to stake our own claim further up the creek. I want to see these men, get a sense of them before we start asking direct questions. And if they recognize me as Thomas's wife. That's unlikely if they never met him properly, Flynn reasoned. But if it happens, we'll deal with it then. They rode out of Prosperity along a narrow trail that climbed steadily along the creek. The terrain grew rougher as they ascended, the forest thicker, casting the path in deep shadow. Despite the physical challenges, Katherine found her mind remarkably clear. Whatever awaited them at the Blackwells' camp, she would face it with the same determination that had carried her across half a continent. They smelled the camp before they saw it, wood smoke and the distinctive odor of a mining operation. Flynn signaled for them to stop, dismounting to secure the horses in a small clearing off the trail. We'll approach on foot, he whispered. Stay close to me, and let me do the talking. Katherine nodded, her hand instinctively checking the small revolver hidden in her coat pocket. Flynn noticed the gesture and gave her a questioning look. Just in case, she said softly. They moved quietly through the trees until they could see the camp below, a collection of tents and crude wooden structures surrounding the entrance to a mine shaft. 6 men were visible, moving about the camp with the casual confidence of those who feared no interference. The 2 by the fire must be the Blackwells, Flynn murmured. They matched the description. Brothers, mid-30s, both wearing red flannel shirts. Katherine studied the men, searching for any sign that might connect them to Thomas. Nothing obvious presented itself until one of the brothers moved toward a larger tent at the edge of the camp. As he pushed the flap aside, Katherine caught a glimpse of something that made her blood run cold, a familiar leather-bound journal lying on a small table just inside. "That's Thomas's journal," she whispered urgently. "The one he's kept since we were married. He would never willingly part with it." Flynn's expression darkened. "Then we have our answer about what happened to him." Katherine felt a strange calm descend over her, a clarity born of certainty. "We need to get that journal. It might tell us exactly what happened." "Katherine," Flynn's voice held a warning, "these men are dangerous. If they killed your husband, they wouldn't hesitate to kill us too." "I'm not suggesting we charge in there," she clarified. "But we need that journal, and we need justice for Thomas." Flynn considered for a moment. "We'll go back to town, speak to the sheriff if there is one. If not, we'll need to find another way." As they began to retreat, Katherine's foot dislodged a stone that clattered down the slope toward the camp. The sound, magnified in the still mountain air, drew immediate attention from the men below. "Someone's up there," one of the Blackwell brothers shouted, reaching for his rifle. "Run!" Flynn grabbed Katherine's hand, pulling her deeper into the forest as shots rang out behind them. They ran blindly at first, crashing through underbrush, putting as much distance between themselves and their pursuers as possible. Flynn led them on a circuitous route back toward their horses, stopping occasionally to listen for sounds of pursuit. "I think we've lost them for now," he finally said, his breathing labored. "But they'll be looking. We need to get back to town quickly." They reached the horses without further incident and rode hard back to Prosperity, the urgency of their situation driving them to push the animals faster than was prudent on the treacherous trail. The settlement came into view just as shouts echoed from further up the mountain. The Blackwells had found their trail and were in pursuit. "There's no sheriff here," Flynn said grimly as they galloped into town. "No law at all from what I gathered." "Then what do we do?" Katherine asked, panic beginning to rise as she realized their predicament. Flynn's expression hardened with resolve. "We find allies. Quickly." He led them directly to the Miners' Rest, where a handful of men were gathered despite the early hour. Flynn burst through the door, Katherine close behind him. "The Blackwells are coming," he announced without preamble. "And they're shooting." The reaction was immediate, men reaching for weapons, moving away from windows, a general tension filling the room. The barkeeper emerged from behind the bar, shotgun in hand. "What did you do?" he demanded. "They spotted us near their camp," Katherine explained breathlessly. "We found evidence they killed my husband and took his claim." The grizzled miner from the previous evening spat on the floor. "Wouldn't be the first time. Those bastards have been terrorizing this valley for months. Ran off the Jenkins boys last month, shot Oldham in the back when he complained about them damming up part of the creek." "Will you help us?" Flynn asked directly. "Or do we ride on and leave you to them?" A tense silence followed as the men exchanged glances, weighing self-preservation against their accumulated grievances. Finally, the barkeeper nodded. "About time someone stood up to those vultures," he declared. "Boys, let's show the Blackwells how we treat murderers in Prosperity." The next hour passed in a blur of activity as the miners prepared their defense. Windows were barricaded, positions assigned, weapons checked and loaded. Katherine found herself stationed upstairs with a clear view of the approach to town, Flynn's spare rifle in her hands. "You know how to use this?" he had asked as he handed it to her. "Point and pull," she had replied with more confidence than she felt. "I'll manage." Now, as she watched the trail for the first sign of the Blackwells, Katherine felt a strange mix of terror and determination. Whatever happened in the coming confrontation, she was no longer the woman who had waited passively on her porch for a husband who would never return. That woman had died somewhere on the long journey from Montana, replaced by someone stronger, someone who fought for answers rather than merely hoping they would come. The Blackwells arrived with the subtlety of a thunderstorm, 6 riders charging into town, guns already drawn, shouting threats and obscenities. The response from the barricaded buildings was immediate and decisive. Gunfire erupted from multiple positions, catching the attackers in a deadly crossfire. 2 of the Blackwells' men fell immediately. A third was wounded, his horse panicking and throwing him before bolting out of town. The brothers themselves and their remaining man took cover behind the water trough and returned fire with practiced precision. Katherine watched through the window, her finger poised on the trigger of Flynn's rifle, waiting for a clear shot. Below her, she could see Flynn moving from one position to another, coordinating the miners' defense with a tactical skill that spoke of experience beyond simple cowboy work. A movement to her left caught her attention, one of the Blackwell brothers attempting to circle around to the side of the building. Katherine steadied the rifle against the windowsill, recalled Thomas's patient instructions from years before, and squeezed the trigger. The recoil slammed into her shoulder as the man below staggered, clutching his arm, before ducking behind a stack of crates. The firefight continued for what felt like hours, but was likely no more than 20 minutes. The tide turned when the barkeeper managed a shot that caught the remaining henchman square in the chest. With only the wounded brothers left, the miners pressed their advantage, moving forward in a coordinated advance that forced the Blackwells into an increasingly desperate position. "Throw down your weapons." Flynn's voice rang out above the diminishing gunfire. "It's over." For a moment, it seemed the brothers might surrender. Then, with the reckless courage of men with nothing to lose, they made a final, suicidal charge toward the saloon. They never made it. Multiple shots rang out, and both men crumpled to the dust of the main street. Their reign of terror in the valley ended with surprising anticlimactic swiftness. In the silence that followed, Katherine lowered the rifle and sat heavily on the bed, her hands trembling with the aftermath of violence. She had never witnessed death before, let alone participated in causing it. The reality of what had just occurred settled over her like a heavy blanket. Flynn found her there minutes later, his expression a mix of concern and relief. "Are you hurt?" he asked, kneeling before her. She shook her head.
No.
Just overwhelmed. His hand covered hers, warm and steady. "You did what was necessary, Katherine. We all did. What happens now?" "Now we go to their camp," Flynn said firmly. "Find that journal and whatever other evidence there might be about Thomas." The journey back to the Blackwells' camp was made in a somber procession, Flynn and Katherine accompanied by 4 of the miners, all armed and watchful despite the unlikelihood of further resistance. The camp itself was deserted, the remaining men having fled when news of the Blackwells' demise reached them. Katherine moved directly to the tent where she had seen Thomas's journal. It lay exactly where she had glimpsed it earlier, its familiar worn leather cover a bittersweet reminder of the husband who had recorded his thoughts and dreams within its pages for years. With trembling hands, she opened it, turning to the final entries. The last dated page was from August 3rd, 1876, "Struck a promising vein today. Richer than anything I've found yet. Could be the answer to all our prayers. We'll need to be cautious, though. Blackwell brothers been sniffing around, asking too many questions. Don't trust them. If all goes well, should have enough to head home to Katherine by month's end. Cool, 이미세." This separation has been a greater cost than I ever anticipated when I left Montana. No amount of gold is worth another day away from her. Katherine's vision blurred with tears as she read the words. Thomas had intended to come home. He had missed her, had finally realized that their life together was more valuable than any gold he might find. "There's more," Flynn said gently, pointing to a folded paper tucked into the back of the journal. "Looks like a letter." The paper was stained with what appeared to be dried blood, the handwriting shaky and urgent. "Katherine, my love. If you are reading this, something has happened to me. The Blackwells ambushed me at my claim. I am wounded, not sure how badly. Hiding in the old Palmer mine while I write this. Will try to get help when night falls. Know that I love you more than life itself. My greatest regret is not returning home when I first promised. The gold blinded me to what truly mattered you, our home, our future together. Forgive me, my darling. Always yours, Thomas. A sob escaped Catherine's throat as the full truth became clear. Thomas had been trying to return to her when he was attacked. He had realized his mistake, had chosen love over gold, but fate had cruelly intervened. The Palmer mine, one of the miners said. It's about a mile east of here. Played out years ago. Flynn squeezed Catherine's shoulder gently. We should go there. If that's where he was hiding when he wrote this. The implication hung heavy in the air. If Thomas had been badly wounded, unable to get help, the Palmer mine entrance was partially collapsed, nature already reclaiming what man had abandoned. Flynn insisted on entering first, lantern held high as he carefully navigated the unstable tunnel. Katherine followed close behind, her heart pounding with dread and the faintest, most torturous hope. They found him 50 feet in, or rather, they found what remained of him after months in the damp darkness of the abandoned mine. Thomas Porter lay against the tunnel wall, a makeshift bandage still wrapped around his chest, his features long since surrendered to the ravages of death. Beside him lay a spent pistol and an empty canteen. Katherine knelt beside the remains of her husband, grief washing over her in waves. Not the frantic, desperate grief of uncertainty, but the clean, clear pain of knowing. Thomas had died alone in the darkness, thinking of her, loving her still despite his mistakes. Flynn stood quietly behind her, offering silent support as she said her goodbyes to the man she had crossed a continent to find. When she finally rose, her face was tear-streaked but composed. He deserves a proper burial, she said simply. He'll have one, Flynn promised. They buried Thomas Porter on a hillside overlooking the valley, with a view of distant mountains and open sky. The miners from Prosperity joined them for the simple ceremony, hats in hands as Katherine recited the Lord's Prayer over the grave. Flynn fashioned a cross from pine branches, carving Thomas's name and the date as best they could determine it. As the others drifted away, Katherine remained by the grave, Flynn a respectful distance behind her. The afternoon sun bathed the valley in golden light, a beauty that seemed at odds with the sorrow of the moment. He wanted to come home, she said finally, her voice steady despite her grief. In the end, he chose us over the gold. He loved you, Flynn replied simply. That much is clear. Katherine turned to face him, studying the man who had become so important to her over their weeks of travel. Thank you for bringing me here, Flynn. For helping me find the truth. I couldn't have done it without you. What will you do now? He asked, his expression carefully neutral. It was a question Katherine had been pondering since they discovered Thomas's fate. The homestead in Montana seemed impossibly distant now, both in miles and in meaning. The woman who had lived there, waiting and hoping, no longer existed. I don't know, she admitted, going back to the homestead alone. I'm not sure I can face that emptiness again. Flynn nodded, understanding in his eyes. You don't have to decide today. We have a long journey back, plenty of time to consider your options. They left Prosperity 3 days later, after ensuring that Thomas's claim was properly recorded in Katherine's name. The mine had indeed yielded a respectable amount of gold, not a fortune, but enough to provide Katherine with financial security for the foreseeable future. The journey east was quieter than their westward trek had been, each lost in their own thoughts about the future. Katherine found herself studying Flynn when he wasn't looking, noting the easy grace with which he moved, the quiet competence he brought to every task, the gentle consideration he showed her as they traveled. Somewhere in Nevada, as they made camp beside a small stream, Katherine finally broached the subject that had been growing between them. What will you do, Flynn? When we return to Montana? He poked at the campfire, his expression thoughtful. Haven't decided yet. Might head south for the winter, find work on one of the big ranches in Colorado. Katherine nodded, trying to ignore the pang of disappointment his answer evoked. You mentioned wanting land of your own someday. Someday, he agreed, glancing up at her. When the time is right. And when would that be? She pressed, suddenly unwilling to let the conversation drift into safer territory. Flynn was silent for a long moment, studying her across the fire. Katherine, he finally said, his voice gentle but direct, your husband has been gone less than 6 months. You're still grieving. Any thoughts or feelings you might have now? They're colored by everything we've been through together. Don't tell me what I'm feeling, Katherine replied, an edge to her voice. I know my own heart, Flynn Donovan. Do you? He challenged softly. Because from where I'm sitting, you've been through more in the past 2 months than most people experience in a lifetime. That changes a person, reshapes them. Yes, it does, she agreed. I'm not the same woman who waited on that porch in Montana. I'm stronger now. I know what I want. And what is that? Katherine met his gaze steadily. Not to be alone. Not to go back to an empty homestead and live with ghosts and might-have-beens. To build something new, with someone who sees me as I am now, not as I was. Flynn's expression softened. Katherine, I'm not asking for promises, she interrupted. I'm not even asking for declarations. I'm simply telling you that when we return to Montana, I intend to sell the homestead. Start fresh somewhere. And I'd welcome your company, in whatever capacity you're willing to offer it. The boldness of her statement surprised even her, but Katherine didn't regret it. The journey had taught her that life was too uncertain, too precious to waste on hesitation and propriety. Flynn was silent for so long that she began to fear she had misread everything between them. Then, with deliberate movements, he rose and came around the fire to sit beside her. I've been alone a long time, he said quietly. Told myself it was better that way, safer. But these past weeks with you. He paused, searching for words. You're an extraordinary woman, Katherine Porter. Braver than most men I've known, and kinder than this harsh world deserves. He took her hand, his calloused fingers gentle against her skin. I can't promise you a perfect life. I'm a simple man with simple dreams. But if you're willing to give me time, give us time, I'd like to see what might grow between us. Katherine felt tears prick her eyes, but they were different from the tears she had shed at Thomas's grave. These were tears of possibility, of hope cautiously rekindled. Time is something I can offer, she whispered. And patience. And faith that whatever grows between us will be stronger for having honest beginnings. Flynn's smile transformed his weather-beaten face, erasing years of solitude and caution. With exquisite gentleness, he leaned forward and pressed his lips to hers, a kiss as light as a promise, as profound as a vow. The remainder of their journey east was marked by a gradual, careful exploration of possibilities. They spoke of practical matters, where they might settle, what kind of life they might build together, but also of deeper things, hopes and fears, regrets and dreams. Katherine shared stories of her life with Thomas, not as a ghost between them, but as an acknowledged part of her past that had shaped the woman she had become. In turn, Flynn revealed more of his own history, his time scouting for the army during the final years of the war, the loss of his fiancée that had sent him wandering, the small dreams of home and family he had never quite abandoned despite his nomadic existence. By the time they reached Montana territory in early December, with snow already blanketing the landscape, a tentative plan had formed. Katherine would sell the homestead in the spring when buyers were more plentiful. Flynn had connections in northern Wyoming, where good grazing land could still be had at reasonable prices. Together, they would start fresh, building something that belonged to both of them. The homestead looked smaller than Katherine remembered, more fragile against the vast Montana sky. As Flynn helped her down from her horse, she stood for a moment, taking in the place that had been the center of her world for so long. "Are you all right?" he asked softly. Katherine nodded, slipping her hand into his. "It's strange. I thought coming back would be harder, but it feels
Right.
like closing a chapter properly before beginning the next." They spent the winter at the homestead, settling into a rhythm of shared work and quiet evenings that felt both new and somehow familiar. Flynn repaired the barn roof that had sagged during Katherine's absence, reinforced fences, and chopped enough firewood to last until spring. Katherine found comfort in the domestic routines she had once resented during her solitary waiting, now transformed by shared purpose and companionship. The community, initially curious about Katherine's return with a man who wasn't her husband, gradually accepted the simplified version of events they offered. Thomas had died in a mining accident. Flynn had helped Katherine discover the truth and bring her husband's affairs to proper closure. If there were whispers about the nature of their relationship, they were muted by respect for Katherine's grief and the obvious care Flynn showed her. By February, Katherine had received several inquiries about the homestead from families looking to establish themselves in the territory. She corresponded with a land agent in Wyoming who had promising options for their future ranch. The pieces of their new life were falling into place with a certainty that felt almost like destiny. On a clear, cold evening in late February, as they sat before the fire in the small cabin, Flynn took Katherine's hand in his. "I've been thinking," he began, uncharacteristic nervousness in his voice.
About us.
"About the future." Katherine squeezed his hand encouragingly. "As have I." "I know we agreed to take things slowly," Flynn continued, "and I respect that. Your heart has been through enough upheaval." He paused, gathering his thoughts. "But I want you to know that my intentions are honorable. When you're ready, if you're ever ready, I'd be proud to call you my wife." The simple declaration, so lacking in flourish yet so full of sincerity, touched Katherine deeply. She looked at this man who had entered her life as a stranger and become essential to her happiness, and knew with absolute certainty that Thomas would have approved. Her husband had wanted her happiness above all else. His final letter had made that clear. "I don't need more time," she said softly. "I know my heart, Flynn Donovan, and it belongs with you now." Their wedding was a simple affair held in the small church in town as April brought the first hints of spring to the Montana landscape. Katherine wore a new blue dress rather than traditional white, a choice that felt right for a beginning that acknowledged rather than erased what had come before. Flynn, in a newly purchased suit, looked both uncomfortable and prouder than she had ever seen him. Mrs. Abernathy, who had checked on the homestead during Katherine's absence, wept openly during the brief ceremony. The local ranchers and townspeople who had come to know and respect both Katherine and Flynn over the winter months filled the small church, their presence a blessing on this new union. As they exchanged simple vows, Katherine thought of the long journey that had brought them to this moment, a journey that had begun in grief and desperation but had somehow transformed into something beautiful and enduring. Flynn's hands were steady as he placed a simple gold band on her finger, his eyes never leaving hers as he promised to cherish and protect her all the days of his life. 2 weeks after the wedding, they sold the homestead to a young family from Minnesota with 3 small children and dreams of building a life in the West. Katherine showed the young wife around the garden she attended, sharing knowledge about which plants thrived in the Montana soil, which needed extra protection from the harsh winters. "It's a good place," she told the woman. "A place where dreams can take root if you nurture them properly." As they loaded the last of their belongings onto the wagon that would carry them to their new beginning in Wyoming, Katherine took a final look at the cabin that had been her first married home. There was sadness in the farewell, but not regret. Thomas would always be part of her story, a chapter written in love and closed with honor. But the pages ahead belonged to her and Flynn, a story they would write together. Flynn helped her onto the wagon seat, his hand lingering on hers. "Ready?" he asked, his eyes reflecting the same mix of excitement and nervous anticipation she felt. Katherine nodded, leaning against his solid shoulder as he flicked the reins to set the horses in motion. "Take me home," she said softly. As the homestead receded behind them and the open country stretched before them, Katherine thought of all the twists and turns that had led to this moment. A woman standing on a porch, waiting for a husband who would never return. A cowboy who had offered to help her find answers. A journey across half a continent that had ended in grief, but also in new beginnings. "He never came home," she had told Flynn all those months ago on her porch. "Then I'll bring you there myself," he had answered. He had kept that promise in ways neither of them could have imagined. Not by bringing her to Thomas, but by bringing her to a new home, one built on truth and choice, and the kind of love that grows stronger through adversity. As they traveled south toward Wyoming and their future, Katherine knew with bone-deep certainty that this was where she was meant to be. Not waiting for life to happen, but riding toward it with purpose and hope, her hand firmly clasped in the hand of the man who had helped her find not just answers, but herself. The road stretched before them, promising challenges and joys in equal measure. But they would face them together, two souls who had found each other against all odds, in the vast, unforgiving beauty of the American West.